My name is Max Gagliardi, and this is the Talk Energy Podcast. If you're watching this video, take a moment, hit the subscribe button on YouTube, or you can follow me on your favorite podcast app. If you left a review on Apple Podcasts, that would really help me out, and I'd appreciate it. You can also subscribe to our energy company's weekly newsletter. That's Ancova Energy Markets on Substack. That's ANCOVA. We put out a newsletter once a week. We've got some pricing data in there. We do some market commentary. Check that out. If you like the channel, I think you'll enjoy it. This episode's guest is Margot Paez, also known on Twitter as Jen Urso. Margot is a PhD candidate at Georgia Institute of Technology and also has a master's in physics. And she works on climate change statistical modeling, specifically in relation to water resources. Margot is also a passionate Bitcoiner and comes at the Bitcoin space from a progressive viewpoint. She recently challenged Alex Epstein, the author of Fossil Futures and Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, to a debate because he got invited to speak at a Bitcoin conference. Basically, she didn't feel like it had anything to do with Bitcoin, and she also felt like he didn't represent all the views of Bitcoiners. And so she challenged him to a debate. I think they're currently working on getting that set up, but I saw this as an opportunity to bring somebody on the podcast who maybe doesn't hold all the same viewpoints that I have. We can get to hear different voices. I've been trying to do that lately. For people that are listening to the channel, I try to get different voices on. And so that's where we were coming from at in this episode. I don't think we debated, but I think it was a healthy discussion. This episode, we talk about the challenges of modeling climate. And I let Margot respond to some of the common criticisms that people level at climate scientists. We discuss some of the common misconceptions around Bitcoin mining and how it can actually lower CO2 emissions. And lastly, we try to find common ground in the energy debate and talk about possible solutions that can lead us forward to a less chaotic climate future. Hope you enjoy the show. Margot, welcome to Talk Energy. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. Cool to be here.
Know you from Twitter, which is like how I meet a lot of my podcast guests these days. And you're in the energy debate a lot of times. You're also in the Bitcoin debate a lot of times, which I also find myself at that intersection as well. And it can get kind of crazy on Twitter. But what I've found is that when you can sit down and talk to people and have one-on-one conversations, a lot of times people see more eye to eye on things than they do in their tweets. And I'm guilty of it as well, like making hot takes and doing mic drops on Twitter. So I thought, this would be a fun episode to do. And I think just to start, for people that don't know you, maybe just some background and then we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah, I'm Margot. On Twitter, I'm Jen Urso with a U. And I am also a fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, where I do policy work at the intersection of Bitcoin mining, energy, and the environment. So I've written a few things for them over the summer. I'm also a PhD candidate at Georgia Tech, where I do research on climate modeling, or I'm working on a climate model right now and desperately trying to finish so that I can graduate, because we're having a funding crunch. So that is right now that's my priority. So I'm also been very much involved in the climate movement as well, and my initial attraction to Bitcoin had nothing to do with climate change. It really was just that I thought that having a monetary network that existed outside of the existing financial system was really, really important for a lot of people who are it's very easy to be deplatformed or unbanked if you don't meet a certain criteria for those. The organizations are mainly, like on the internet, mainly it's Visa and MasterCard that really decide who gets access to the payment rails. So if you do something they don't like, you are totally at a loss of being able to make any kind of money online. So I thought that was a good reason to have Bitcoin. And then later on, I started looking at the energy issue. Was there an energy issue around Bitcoin and its environmental impact, and decided that actually there's enough positive things going on and enough built into the protocol itself to feel more confident that Bitcoin could actually be useful for people who are concerned about climate change. So that's pretty much how I got here and my background.
Cool. What was before the PhD? What did you do? What did you study? And what kind of led you into doing the climate stuff?
Yeah, I studied physics. I started off as in physics, and I also was doing robotics. So my PhD actually was in the physics department, where I was working on in an area called physics of living systems, and I was building robotic models. And one of the few labs in the country that actually does this kind of work. So I built a few robots while I was there. One was a sidewinding snake model, and I
Cool.
was able to figure out how to model how an actual sidewinder snake navigates around an obstacle in its natural environment. So that was the kind of work I was doing before, just being a physicist that really liked building things. So a little bit of an engineer as well. And then I started, well, I was already worried about inaction around climate change, and I didn't think that that politicians were taking it seriously enough. So at some point, I just felt like I needed to do more. So I changed my academic objective and switched departments to the civil and environmental engineering department, and effectively had to start over. And that's how I ended
Yeah.
up in the group that I'm in now.
It's interesting. You have a passion about something and you're trying to do something about it, which I think is cool. A lot of people don't try to do anything about it.
Yeah.
They say they are passionate about it and they don't actually do anything. I think that's admirable. What about, how did you get on to, you told me the reasons why you like Bitcoin, and I agree with all those reasons. I do think that the ability to transact is kind of the basis of all freedom. And most people these are things that I actually came to Bitcoin from the energy side, just trying to understand,
Totally
my
froze.
whole career's kind of been, what's that?
Oh, sorry, it totally froze. Could you repeat the question?
Oh, no worries. Just, yeah, like I said, sometimes it kind of glitches and sometimes there's a lag. So just, we'll do the best we can. This is it. I'll either edit this out or I won't. Doesn't matter. They can listen. It's free content. Um, I said that I came at Bitcoin kind of from the angle of energy, and I've always been at this space where I'm like trying to the intersection of monetization of energy, so building infrastructure, how to get energy to market, how to get the most value for your energy, and so that's how I got interested in Bitcoin, and then all these things like you talked about the freedom money aspect of it. I've always kind of had sort of a libertarian kind of moderate bent to my belief system, and so I thought this is really cool. It's neutral. It can benefit anyone, and it's this uncensorable thing. And so that was kind of the hook that got me later. And when I really started feeling like, man, I'm becoming like a Bitcoiner. But what was the moment with Bitcoin? You told me why you liked it, but how did you get involved and get interested in it?
Yeah, it was really when I realized that Bitcoin could be part of the solution for dealing with inaction around climate change, because I was looking at the financial system and trying to understand what was stopping people from doing anything about it. And I realized that, and this maybe is just because I also participated in the Occupy movement, so I already had a sense that the financial system, the banking industry, were not really working in favor of everyday people. Yeah, so scientists are generally not interested in being activists. The other thing, though, I think is when you go through the PhD program, you're basically the people who survive are the ones who are able to jump through the hoops and not be controversial in any way, because your advisor is pretty much in control of your whole future. Your advisor is the one person who can make or break your future as a scientist or an engineer or whatever when it comes to your PhD. And it's in that sense you kind of learn that in order to survive, you don't want to make a lot of waves, and you just need to do the work and put up with it. So I think that the people who get through the PhD and become professors tend to have this sense that they just need to be able to do the work, not make a lot of waves, not bring a lot of controversy to themselves, because they could risk their career. So I don't I don't really agree with that statement too much. The other thing, what you said, it is going to be very hard for you to go to a department and say, I want to study something that I think disproves climate change, because, and the reason why that's difficult is because there have been decades and decades and decades, to some degree even, more than a century of understanding just from the physics itself, that putting additional CO2 into the atmosphere is going to change the climate. And we have known this pretty much since the late 1800s. And even the petroleum industry has known this at least since the 1950s. Well, I forgot this one physicist's name, but he was an atomic physicist, and he basically told them, what, you're putting all these emissions into the atmosphere and you're going to cause a lot of problems within 100 years from now. So it's not really that the fundamental physics of climate change is not really up for debate. It is pretty settled. It's fundamental physics. And so you really are going to have a hard time finding anyone taking you seriously in that regard. The challenge is, of course, is trying to understand what will happen, locally. How will the climate change? How negative would those effects be? And so that's where a lot of the modeling comes in. That's where a lot of the experiments, the empirical data has to come in. Scientists go out to the Arctic and to the Antarctic, and they collect ice cores and they bring them back to the lab and they do a lot of analysis. And I know personally, I've worked with scientists who have done this, not actually around climate change, but looking at analogs to to other planets. So, I've worked in astrobiology at JPL, at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in NASA. So I've known my mentors there. They went and they did ice core collection. So there's a lot of strategies. There's isotopes that you can look at. We know just by looking at the atmosphere, the makeup, the ratio of the isotopes of carbon. We know, so that's chemistry. So we know that there's a unique isotope signature that comes from fossil fuels versus from biogenic origins, right? So there's a lot of fundamental science here. So I think, you would have a really hard time, but only because the science is just really that good on what climate change is and what is causing it.
For sure. How hard is it to differentiate the man-made stuff versus the natural climate changing? My dad's a geologist and an engineer, and my brother's I'm kind of like the only non-engineer scientist. And so I learned as a kid, just kind of about the basics of like the recent ice age, and look at the global temperature data. It's like swinging 10 degrees, like in the span of like this really short time. So like, how do you weed through the noise? This is the last climate question. I'm actually genuinely interested in this stuff because, when people bring up FUD, I want to have a more informed take rather than just, being like, oh yeah, I'm just going to repeat this FUD. So I am generally interested on how we like differentiate between the man-made versus the just the natural craziness of the planet.
Yeah, I think the easiest way is just looking at the isotopes, and they also do that with methane as well, where they're looking at isotopes to see which one come from bio origins versus anthropogenic origins. The actual nitty-gritty of the details, I couldn't tell you because I don't do that work, and I don't fully know how they're actually going out into the field and collecting that data. But I do know that it is generally isotope based in that regard, to be able to differentiate between the two types. You can just capture, I guess, the carbon coming from fossil fuels, and you can capture carbon coming from the natural environment, maybe decomposition of plants, and you can run some sort of analysis on it, and you would be able to see some kind of ratio or some percentage of which is, let's say, C13 or C14, right? So these are really standard. Understanding isotopes goes way back into chemistry and into the early origins of looking at the atomic aspect, radiation, radioactive chemistry, Curie, so
Sure.
they have their techniques. I think they're pretty well established, and that's just one way. Looking at the ice cores, you can also see the makeup in there, and they have paleoclimate data that I think they also collect through various bio-originated markers in which they've preserved aspects of the climate going back centuries or millions, hundreds of millions of years even. So there's lots of techniques, but it's like everybody's in their own field and they know what I can't be an expert in all of those fields, so I have to rely on the research that they do.
Seems like everybody on Twitter is an expert in every field, right? It's like everybody wants to make these comments like they know everything about everything. Okay, so the other day you challenged Alex Epstein to a debate. I can't remember specifically what the debate, what the premise of it was, but talk about the motivation to challenge him to a debate. Is that you going to go on? Did it end up going to happen, or I can't remember if it fizzled out? And then tell me why you wanted to do it.
Yes, it's in the works still. The venue organizers are busy with something else right now, so I'm waiting for them to get back to actually preparing for the venue that we're discussing, and so hopefully within a month I'll know for sure whether or not this is going to happen. But he has agreed to it at least, but I think we probably have to discuss this proposition that he himself has presented, which is it's like we need a rapid elimination of fossil fuels to avoid climate catastrophe, something like that, which is I think there's a lot of buzzwords in there, and I think that needs to be refined before that kind of proposition could be agreed to. But the reason why I did it was because I see a lot of his talking points in Bitcoin Twitter. And I actually had never heard of him until I started being more active on Bitcoin Twitter, and I started seeing his book crop up and his name, and that's the first time I had actually ever heard of this guy. Yeah, well, so I saw that he was invited to the Pacific Bitcoin Conference, and I found that really troubling because I don't think that, I haven't really seen any evidence that Alex Epstein is a Bitcoiner who is actually prioritizing the advancement of Bitcoin and improving adoption, or trying to work on a lot of the FUD that is around Bitcoin, or being really involved in the space. He seems to be really solely focused on the promotion of fossil fuels. So I thought, this just seems really wrong for a conference to invite somebody like Alex Epstein, or I think he says his name is Epstein, really. So to invite Alex Epstein to the conference when he really is not advancing the Bitcoin narrative. So, and I have heard him speak, and I have read some of his book, and I think that a number of the things that he says in his book are very misleading, and he seems to have a bit of an agenda that I really very much disagree with, and I worry about, because we really do have a serious situation here with regard to climate change, and what happens with inaction. If we don't actually do something about it, it will get worse. So I see him, even though he does say that he's not denying that carbon emissions increase global temperature, at the same time, he is also claiming that the IPCC reports cannot be trusted, and therefore, and because of his one metric of climate deaths, which I think is not, if you look into it, it doesn't, I don't think it's very sound statistics what he's doing there. But that's besides the point. But he's basically, what he's doing is saying yes, it's causing warming, but no, you don't have to do anything about it. And I think that that's really dangerous because the evidence is that actually you do need to do something about it. So if you're denying that we should do something about it, then you're really still a climate denier. You're still denying climate change because one aspect of it is that it is negatively affecting humanity and the planet. So that to me is a really dangerous thing to allow to spread, that idea to allow that to spread. And I thought that as a Bitcoiner, it's important for someone like Alex Epstein to know that not every person in this space is going to agree with him and is going to give him a pass to make these statements. And I really wanted to make that clear that he's not just getting people are not just going to open their arms and embrace him and say, oh yeah, everybody in Bitcoin thinks just like you, because that's not the case. Not everybody does. And I really wanted to get that message across. So that's why I decided to do this, to challenge him to a debate, mostly because I really wanted to send that message that it wasn't going to be easy for him to do this. And it blew up. And it was a pretty crazy response, what happened. And I got multiple people saying, yeah, we'd host this. But his conditions are that it has to be on a really big platform. So that's why this is still up in the air, because I'm trying to get the biggest platform possible in the Bitcoin space to host it in order for him to actually do it. So that's what happened. That was my motivation behind it. And I'm from California. I'm from Los Angeles, and the Pacific Bitcoin Conference is being hosted there. And that's my home. That's where I grew up. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought about his message and what he's trying to do, the more I look around at where I live, and I see the beautiful mountains, and I think of our beach and all the natural wonders in California that I cherish so much and that are part of who I am and what they've given to me as a person, what the natural world has given to me. I just really couldn't let him, show up in my hometown without somebody saying, your ideas are not going to be welcomed by everyone here.
So I get some of the criticisms. The first one I think that is pretty solid point is that it's really not that much to do with Bitcoin. If you think about his messaging, it is around energy and around fossil fuels in particular, and the benefits that he thinks that they have. Now, maybe there's a loose tie there between Bitcoin uses energy to mine it. Energy is the backbone of the system, and that Bitcoin is getting attacked a lot for quote unquote being dirty or people criticizing it. And so maybe they were trying to say there are positives to using fossil fuels. This guy's an advocate for that. That's like a loose connection, but I do get the criticism that he's really not in the Bitcoin space. I think the first time he did a Bitcoin thing was with Marty Bent on his podcast a while back. And he was like, so I remember listening to that one. He's like, I really haven't thought much about Bitcoin. And that was not that long ago. It's been within the last year or so. So that's a fair criticism. But if you had to think about what the questions, like what would the core of the debate be? Like, where would you want to go with it if you do this thing? Like, what do you want to specifically debate him about in terms of, like you mentioned, the climate death things? You don't think that's a great metric, but what are some other metrics or some other things that you feel like this would be a really strong ground for me to make some counter arguments to some of the things that he's put forward?
Yeah, okay, so it's been a little while now since I've thought about this, because I've had to reorient myself to finish my research for my PhD. So when I do that, I sort of lose track of my focus of what I had before. But the climate deaths for me is a really big one, because he bases much of his argument against taking action around this one statistic that is based off of MDAT data. And the MDAT data is actually sourced from the medical community, I believe. I believe that those researchers are like medical doctors, that's their background, or epidemiologists, right? So they're the ones who are collecting that data. And really what it is it's like natural disaster deaths and the effects of natural disasters on communities around the world. And so he uses that. And then he also is trying to find a correlation between that and the HADCRET data, which is the measurement of CO2 emissions over time. Let's see, it's either emissions or it's global temperature anomalies.
He plots it over a couple of different things, but basically he's like, here are the deaths over time, here's the emissions. I think he does.
No. But that's the data set he's referencing. So in his Fossil Future book, I have an ebook version of it, and there's no plot, at least in the first part. Maybe there is later, but in the first part, he just has a reference in the background, and he says he's using the HACRET data and he's using the MDAT data, and then he did his own sort of back of the envelope calculation to come up with this reduction in climate deaths. But he never actually went the step to prove whether there is in fact a correlation. I mean, that's a fundamental basis of statistics. Is first you have to show to me and prove to me that these two data sets are even correlated. Is that climate death data that you're claiming correlated to that HACRET data? And what is that Pearson correlation? So he never gave that value. And he also, I mean, generally your next step would be to actually have like a linear regression model. And then I would be able to ask some follow-up questions, which he hasn't done either. So he doesn't have a forecast into the future of whether or not those quote unquote climate deaths are going to continue to decline, right? So that's another problem there. So you can't really present that unless you know for sure that your data sets are correlated. Otherwise, that's just a coincidence, and that's not clear.
Yeah,
and he uses climate deaths, and he talks about the IPCC in that book, and he says, yeah, but did you know that the climate deaths aren't even a variable that's mentioned in the IPCC, and therefore because that they didn't even use it, and I just told you that climate deaths have gone down as fossil fuels and emissions have gone up, that therefore the IPCC should be thrown out, basically, is what he's saying, which is a really, really terrible argument to make. It doesn't stand on its own if you really dig into it. You can't deny the entire body of the IPCC based off of your own back of the envelope calculation that it itself is problematic from the fundamental statistics.
So taking a step back from just the climate deaths, I think the broader point, I'm not finished with this book. I read The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels years ago. It's been a long time, but I have not finished Fossil Futures. I'm probably like halfway or a little over halfway done with it. But I think the broader point that he's trying to make, if I could characterize it correctly, is that there is a sense in the climate world, in not just the climate world, but also, for example, the renewable space, to really focus on one side of the argument. So whether that's, hey, there's going to be these issues with drought, fire, whatever they may be, that we can show there's a higher statistical chance that these are happening, and therefore this is a crisis. Or for example, like with renewables, you see it a lot where people really don't ever want to focus on some of the bad things. Like, yes, it's a lot of land usage. There's a lot of resource usage with this. And I think his argument basically is like, look, if you're going to talk about something, you have to show the pros and the cons. And so another example is like, people throw out, X amount of people die a year from smog inhalation or whatever it is from pollution. But if you look at somebody like a Vaclav Smil, who is, I think, very down the middle. I mean, he's basically numbers and facts driven. He talks about things like if we were to lose hydrocarbons as a source for fertilizer, his estimates show between half and 2/3 of the population would just die if we didn't have fossil fuel-based fertilizers. So I think Alex's argument is that, like, yes, there are problems. Yes, there is pollution. Yes, there is a warming climate, but we have to weigh that against the benefits of these things. And then only then can we have the full picture. And I do agree that sometimes, not just in the renewable side or the other side, but both sides do it, where you focus on just these positives, but you don't want to ever talk about, what the negatives could be if we were to say like ban fossil fuels for fertilizer or whatever, do these other things. So that to me is where I think is kind of argument is, do you see the benefits of having do you get that argument at all, or do you disagree with that premise, I guess?
Yeah. So first of all, I think I hear what you're saying, but I do think that I think Epstein has I think he has a much more negative motive than just that, but I'll save that for the debate. But in terms of what you're saying, I mean, yes, of course. I think Vaclav Smil is fantastic. In fact, I'm reading one of his books right now, and I love the thoroughness of what he does. And yeah, he's absolutely right. And that's the tragedy, actually, because you will also lose billions of lives if you do nothing about climate change and you allow business as usual. So this is like a devil's bargain that we've made, actually, and we've allowed ourselves. And the fascinating thing about our adoption of fossil fuels is that for many parts of the world, fossil fuels didn't become a truly dominant energy source, really not even until the early 1900s. Like some places were still burning wood, right? And so if you think about it in that sense, fossil fuels have done so we've managed to do so much with fossil fuels as a dominant energy source for so little time in the history and the span of human civilization. And at the same time, we've managed to do an incredible amount of destruction at the same time. And so we have to really ask ourselves, is this the path that we want to continue on? Because there is no denying that without the advances that we've had with fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers, that we would not be able to sustain almost 8 billion people on this planet. But if we don't have alternative solutions, and if we don't say, okay, if we continue on this path, our ability to sustain these people, this amount of people, is going to diminish. We're going to have diminishing returns because the effects on the environment itself are going to be so great that it's going to overwhelm the benefits of being able to produce this synthetic fertilizer with fossil fuels or natural gas, right? That's going to outweigh it. And then we're going to see a decline in population because we did nothing to change the way our system operates and the way we produce all of our food, our agriculture, and how we sustain it at the industrial scale, right? So I think that is the reality that we have to come to grips with. And it's not enough to say, yeah, fossil fuels have made it possible for us to have nearly 8 billion people on this planet. We have to also say, yes, and it is also putting those lives at risk if we continue to do that. And that's what the scientific evidence is showing us, that we have tipping points. And the paleoclimate data is telling us that if we were to go into, let's say, a 3-degree warmed world, we may not be able to sustain more than a few billion lives on this planet, even using fossil fuels. So that is really the problem. And I'm not going to sit here and say we should have never had fossil fuels, or, they didn't do good things, because the 20th century had a lot of problems, but there was a lot of great stuff too. And there is no denying that if you have an energy surplus that frees people up from working in the fields to be able to use their minds to create new things, to be able to study the universe, to be able to create the best art, the most beautiful music, right? The literature, whatever, all of the culture that we have as a society is possible. The way that we're able to maximize culture is because we have an energy and agricultural surplus. If we lose that one way or another, we don't have those surpluses, we're going to lose that ability. And so that is I think was what we need to be focused on, is finding out the best way for us to maintain our society and to maintain those energy surpluses so that we don't lose, more than half of the world population.
Right. Do you think, like you and I have argued before on Twitter, and the one argument that I think we got into was around the crisis element of climate change and the catastrophe stuff that you'd mentioned about there's these tipping points, and once we hit this, then like all these people are going to die. The part that I've struggled with, and this is a question just from me to you, because I think it's easier to talk about it, is that when I've gone in and looked at like the IPCC, when I've gone in and looked at some of these different reports, I have not seen the part in there where it's saying like the world's going to end or all these people are going to die. It's more scientific. It's more like, hey, look, this could cause more drought, which could negatively impact this part of the world. And some people may have more drought, but by the way, there could be more rain in this part of the world. So to me, when I read the science, it seems more nuanced. But then when you hear people talk about it, it seems like it's very clear cut. Like we're heading off of a cliff. So I don't know. That's the part that I've struggled with. What would you say to me to convince me that we are heading off of a cliff, and that even though I'm not reading that in some of these reports? I mean, because that's the part where I've struggled with it's a crisis thing versus it's a problem. Like I think there's a difference between it being a problem and being like a crisis. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So, okay. So first of all, the IPCC tends to be conservative, right? There are socio-political influences, but it's not in the direction that most people think it is, which is like to control people. It's actually, they're trying to take all of the data, all of the papers, and they do these models, they do these social economic pathways, and they're trying to fit it into something that they think is most feasible, right? So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, you're not going to really hear in the IPCC directly in the data that this is a catastrophe, because that's not how generally what science results say. They don't make that next step. That next step is just, it comes from interpreting those results, I think. Right. So if you see all of these droughts, if you see flooding, then there are certain steps that come past that. But they also look at, they have different scenarios. There's like the 1.5.
Right. RPC, then there's like whatever, and
there's the RPC 8.5. There's this. So the 8.5 has been really controversial, but if you then go and look at the paleoclimate data, which is something that James Hansen has really recommended, because he himself he's a little concerned on some of the modeling as well. And from his perspective, that this is very dangerous, and he calls it I don't know if he called it the Faustian bargain, I think. But so he's saying that there are certain things that are being overlooked and not fully put into these models or in these pathways, like looking at what happens when you remove sulfur pollution and how that increases warming, or even he talks about how there's not enough emphasis on bringing on more nuclear power plants. So the IPCC tends to be more conservative. I think mostly because there are some sort of certain political pressures in that regard. But even if nowadays you'll see in the last set of reports, there was a discussion of loss and damages. And that loss and damages is really about how the global south is already suffering the effects of climate change, and that there are things that we can no longer change, we can no longer prevent, that there are some things that are already built in, and there's some things that we're already going to lose. And that's happening already in a world that is only warmed 1.1 degrees Celsius. So this is a sort of not the most sharpened response that I can give you, but I think that if you probably have to really dig in through the technical report versus the policymaker report, because those tend to be a little bit different. And right. the countries themselves, their own political leaders or appointees, whatever, they tend to influence the wording in the policymaker reports versus the technical reports. But there are studies out there. I mean, there really are studies out there that are showing that there are serious concerns here. And that's generally why you're seeing more and more scientists speaking out who really work in climate science. Now, I'm just a physicist who's doing climate change related work, but I didn't study atmospheric sciences. I studied physics. So I don't have that highly detailed expertise that they do. And they are really panicked and depressed and going through a lot psychologically because they know that there is such a huge probability that things could really take a turn for the worse, that there's really only so much that the planet can sustain before there's these feedbacks that happen. And that's why you are seeing scientists become activists like Peter Kalmus. So, long story short, we may already be in a feedback with methane right now. So the problem is that it's hard for us to know for sure until it's too late. And I think that is really what the key takeaway is from all of this, from the IPCC and everything that has come out from the academy, is that the climate is itself a probability spectrum, right? It's a distribution of probabilities of what could happen. And what we're doing is we're making it much more likely for extremes to happen than they used to. And because of that, it's going to make it much more difficult for us to build infrastructure to withstand these damaging events. And it's going to make it harder for us to really know when it's appropriate or how long the growing season is going to be in any particular region in the world. It's going to make everything that we've come to take for granted in terms of how the planet works, how the atmosphere works, and the climate much more harder. And that, I think, is what we really need to understand, is that you don't want to take that risk, because a world of increased uncertainty is going to be very difficult for humans to manage, because humans don't manage probabilities very well. And people take things for granted as always being one thing, right? Your whole life, things were always this way, and now all of a sudden it's not. Now what do you do? And how do you predict that if the models become difficult to run, to forecast, like what I'm doing and what we're seeing in water resources, right? That becomes very difficult from the civil engineering perspective. How are you going to build buildings to withstand a tsunami if there's more, if sea level rise is happening, right? Because that means you're going to have increased run up, and all of our metrics for building a tsunami evacuation building is based off of previous records of what the last greatest run up is and what was, right? So that makes it really difficult. Some buildings are built where you have to know the 1 in 1,000 likelihood event happening. Well, what happens if you no longer know what that is? Because the 1 in 1,000 is now 1 in 100 or 1 in 10 or something, because the probabilities have increased, right? So all of that is destabilizing to our entire civilization. So that is a massive risk that I think is not really well understood by the general public, that all of this is becoming a much riskier venture. Life is becoming riskier because the climate is becoming less predictable.
Well, I will agree with you that we do not handle even a little bit of crisis very well in unpredictability. I mean, we saw with COVID, which was, in some regards worse than some people thought, in some regards turned out better than some people thought. But it was something that I think the entire planet struggled with. And it made me feel like there was a fragility to society that was quite frankly scary, that everything from the supply chain to just the way people behaved, it was a more eye-opening aspect to things in terms of the world's stability than I thought maybe had a false sense of prior to that. So I can agree that destabilizing events can be more catastrophic than people would assume that they could be. And unfortunately, right now, I have to probably go. I wanted to get more into the Bitcoin and we had the technical difficulties, and I've got another thing here in 15 minutes, and I got to drive over there. But maybe next time if we do something again, we could talk more about the Bitcoin side and mining and a lot of the FUD there. I intend to, in these things, get into questions that interest me, even though I had an agenda where I wanted to get more into the using Bitcoin mining around some of the renewables and some of these things, because I think there's a lot of potential there. But thank you for coming on. This is good. I'm glad we could have a conversation about it again. I think this is important.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that I could be able to join you on your show finally.
Yeah, absolutely.
And maybe we can do it again. The difficulties. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. All right, Margot. Thank you.
All right. Take care. Thanks, man.